Chris O'Connor here. Join our prestigious Curmudgeonly community on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/curmudgeonrock. Also be on the lookout for a Spotify playlist dedicated to this episode. Now let's get started.
This is the Curmudgeon Rock Report, and this is your podcast made by rock geek iconoclastic outsiders for rock geek iconoclastic outsiders. For those of you who lament that rock music has gone the way of jazz and slipped into niche genre status, we are here to keep that flame alive by providing insight, analysis, recommendations, and honest takes, not hot takes. And hey, there's a good chance you'll learn some rock history you never knew before. R.E.M. were one of the truly iconic bands of the 1980s and 1990s. In the 1980s, they were the definitive American indie alternative band that, alongside more hardcore outfits like Black Flag and Husker Du, blazed a trail along the network of independent venues that defined the rock underground at the time. They were direct musical influence and ideological inspiration for many, and I mean many, of the generation-defining and epochal bands of the 1990s. In the 1990s, R.E.M. built on the unexpected hit singles they had in the late 1980s and became superstars. They were a ubiquitous presence on rock radio and MTV. They had sold-out arena tours all over the world, and they were among the most respected and admired elder statesmen rock music ever produced. By the 2000s, the hits really stopped coming for R.E.M., but they chugged on as a legacy act until their breakup in 2011. Yet, a very curious and honestly discouraging thing has happened since then that really got started at the end of the 1990s. As an expat who lives here in South Korea, I can tell you that most, if not all, of the other fellow expats that I hang out with here are either millennial generation or Gen Z people. I can also tell you it seems that most younger generation rock music fans, particularly millennials and Gen Z people, have either completely forgotten them or just about outright dislike them. You even get this through social media and platforms such as YouTube and the such. The hipster douchebag dickheads behind the revoltingly obnoxious podcast Your Favorite Band Sucks once devoted an entire episode to how much they hate R.E.M. In addition to showing bad musical taste, which those idiots demonstrate on a regular basis, that vitriol reflects a broader issue. Why is it that R.E.M., a band that got inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2006, their first year of eligibility, and is generally regarded as one of the 10 or 20 greatest American bands of all time, why is it that they are so lightly regarded by the aforementioned millennials and Gen Z music fans? Is Shiny Happy People, which is by far the worst of their hit songs, is it that bad of a song that it overwhelms their otherwise rich, eclectic, and dense discography? Were they overexposed in their day? Was their music in the 2000s so bad that it canceled the brilliance of the previous 2 decades? Or are there other, more nefarious culture war-related reasons at work here? U2, The Cure, Depeche Mode, The Pixies. These are all 1980s bands that are more revered by millennials and Gen Zers than R.E.M. And that really isn't fair at all. After all, if you're a millennial or a Gen Zer who loves Nirvana and Radiohead, 2 of the 4 and biggest and best bands of the 1990s, Pearl Jam and Oasis being the other 2, why wouldn't you like R.E.M.? Members of Nirvana and Radiohead and Pearl Jam throughout the years have gone at length in interviews gushing about both the musical and ideological influence and impact R.E.M. had on them. Both of yours truly curmudgeons are unabashed R.E.M. fans who count them as a seminal band of our youth and lifetime. This particular curmudgeon counts them as perhaps his all-time favorite band. So, in this episode, we will first investigate why REM's popularity and seemingly timeless quality plummeted so much in the past 20 plus years. And then we'll make the very detailed case as to why they should be remembered more fondly and should be held in the same regard as other iconic all-time great American bands such as the Beach Boys, the Velvet Underground, Creedence Clearwater Revival, the Stooges, and, yes, Nirvana. Renowned British music journalist and R.E.M. biographer Tony Fletcher will be a very special guest in this very personal and very passionate episode of the Curmudgeon Rock Report as we bring you R.E.M. Remember those guys?
So, Arturo, before we get into our fantastic interview with Tony Fletcher, the author of Perfect Circle, a biography of R.E.M., we should address one thing. R.I.P. Andy Roarke of the Smiths, who was a friend of Tony's. So it's a cause to remember the Smiths a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, Rourke, the rhythm section of the Smiths was always very underrated, and they got better as the years went on. By the time of
Sure.
The Queen is Dead in 1986, which I think is a perfect album,
Yeah.
they were one of the best rhythm sections in all of rock. They were rock steady. The Smiths had this reputation, at least I don't know, among their detractors, for being a little too twee. But
Yeah.
if
They
you
were
ever
pretty
listen,
twee, but they were muscular.
they were muscular, yeah. No,
They were muscularly twee.
yeah, or tweely muscular. But if you if you check out some of the live stuff on YouTube, I mean, they rocked and they rocked live, and they always sounded a little different live than they did in the studio,
Thank
and.
goodness.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, and the reason for that is because they had those guys were good musicians. They could play. You know, Joyce was a really solid drummer. Marr was a brilliant guitar player. You know, they were a great band, man.
Technically a good band. I've never been a huge fan, and that has mostly to do with Morrissey. I just have a distaste for Morrissey. But I'll tell you, there's still a place where the Smiths are really heavily revered. You know where that place is, Artie?
Where is that?
That is in the parallel universe.
Uh-huh.
Yes, folks, we are crossing over into the other side of the space-time continuum, as we are wont to do on every episode of the Curmudgeon Rock Report. Over there, green is blue and black is white, and rock and roll is still the music of choice among the kids, among the middle-aged folks, among the boomers. It is still rocks, and people still care hugely. Although we'll get into that in a minute. Apparently, people still care about REM a little bit more than we think. Just a little bit, though. And so, at least that was endearing. And
Yeah.
so, so folks, this is our segment where we cover newish or new albums that we think deserve some attention, and we each do a pick on every episode. So, Arturo, who are you giving love to here in the parallel universe on this episode?
Yes. It's Acid Arab and their album Trois, which is the French word for three. I admit this is a bit of cheating on my part since this album isn't really rock in any sense. However, it is a fun, funky, danceable as shit record that I think deserves some props and attention. Acid Arab are a DJ duo from Algeria. And as the album title suggests, this is their third album. They expertly meld electronic dance music in its various forms, mostly techno, a little bit of house here, a little bit of dubstep there, to traditional North African dance and pop music, the kind of which you would hear in Algeria, Morocco, and Egypt. What you get here also, because this is North African, you get the twisty, bending vocal melodies that are a hallmark of the music of the latter, of that region of the world, with the driving rhythms of the former, the EDM, to create this intoxicating blend that can be best described as sexy elasticity or elastic sexiness, whichever
There
you
you go.
prefer. Choice cuts and the slightly psychedelic done done the four on the floor disco stomp of Yamachla, the head shaking killer groove of Habaitak, and the delectable acid house Arabic pop fusion of Acid Chawi. This is a great record to shake your ass to while you're eating your falafel with hummus.
Okay. Uh, I'll just put it this way. I think I'd rather listen to my Elastic Waistband than listen to this album and this band. Ass Arab. Not a huge fan of this record. I do like traditional North African folk music, but I like it straight. I think putting the fuzzy reverb and the house drums on it just strikes me as corny as shit, and it gets to the point where it's a little too amped up. And I don't know. Obviously, their fans are. Uh, I suspect that Daft Punk might be heroes in their world because of their drum programming and their aesthetic. If you remove the the folk music, is very close to what Daft Punk did way back 2+
Yeah.
decades ago. So I don't know. I'm just not that enthused by it. And if I want to listen to that kind of stuff, I'll stick to I'll stick to what was it called, like the Rough Trade Guide to World Music. Uh,
Which is an
yeah,
insulting term. Anything that's not Western, it's world music. Dude, to the
yeah.
people of those countries, rock and roll is world music.
Oh, no shit, no shit. I know that, but what I'm saying is there's I like my world music a whole lot less housey, and I don't want dancey Arabic folk. I really don't.
I do.
So okay, well,
We gotta have you gotta have some amalgams. It's nice to be
yeah,
cheerful and dance and I mean
yeah.
some of the people in some of these countries they don't some of these countries are pretty poor. Let them
I know.
dance. Let them
Yeah,
dance.
I know. Let them dance. But frankly, some of this shit reminds me when you and I lived in Astoria, 100 years ago, and it just reminds me of all those like musky looking dudes in like black V-neck T-shirts that.
Hey, those were some sexy men. I tell you right
Oh,
now.
oh, would you stop? They have nothing on Michael Hutchins, man. Yeah, okay. Anyway, so my record, it's an album that in some ways is so polarizing it might polarize itself. Uh, this is an album, one of those albums. There's a grand tradition in rock and roll of an album that you can call a 3-star record. That 40% of it is garbage, but the other 40 to 60% of it is good enough that 2 decades later, like out in the future, you still find yourself coming back to at least that portion of the record. An example for me would be Cake's Fashion Nugget. It's that kind of record where Fashion Nugget is one of these records that most of it is kind of dregs, but there's like 4 or 5 songs on it that I love, especially the title track. Shut the fuck up.
Yeah.
Good stuff. But so this is one of those kinds of records. This is an album by a band from North Carolina named Wednesday, and the name of the album is Rat Saw God. This is an interesting band. One of the albums from last year that I liked the most. It was on number 20 on my year-end list, but now has risen to be in my top 5 from last year's MJ Letterman's Boat Songs. Well, MJ Letterman is in another band. They're based in Asheville called Wednesday. And he's not the front person on this. He's a co-songwriter and a guitarist. But this is a forum for a young woman named Carly Hartzman. And Miss Hartzman is either she's darkly funny or just dark, because this is a really interesting record in the sense that her theme is it's a nostalgia, but it's not a good kind of nostalgia. It's the I'm now in my early 20s and there were some fun times and there were some remembrances and now I'm lonely. But wasn't it cool when we had that party where one of us OD'd on Benadryl? Or you remember when the neighbors got busted for cocaine trafficking? And she also has fascination with death scenes and yellow police tape and this kind of stuff. And so you would think that that's kind of morbid, but in some ways it's kind of fun. And when they get it right, it is really strong. There are pretty much from the fourth song to just about the end of the record. There is some wonderful stuff on there. Best song I've heard all year is called "Chosen to Deserve." It's a mid-tempo rocker that gives a whiff of No Depression era bands like the Jayhawks and obviously Uncle Tupelo. Lovely pedal steel flourishes juxtaposed against a simple, crunchy guitar riff. It gives everything a dreamy and again nostalgic feel. And she's an interesting case because she's basically, this is a song sung to a new love interest or new boyfriend about, here's all the stuff I've been through. And the chorus is, I'm the girl that you were chosen to deserve. And so really kind of compelling. And again, I think it's just a really great song. It rocks. It actually has a hook and good melodies. And that's the middle of the record. So that to me is a highlight. Another highlight I would say is a song called Formula One, which is also in the middle of the record. It's a little bit slower and stretchier, almost has like a codeine stretch quality to it. If there's such a thing as screwed and chopped in the rock and roll world, maybe it's something like this. And it has this, again, really kind of quirky lyrics. And it's her fascination with birds that have a tendency to run into a window every day and never die, but then come back and do it again. Nowhere near as good as Boat Songs by MJ Letterman, which is one of the quirkier albums of the last decade. Odes to his father's love for Dan Marino, and an ode to and empathy for wrestlers that get thrown off the top of steel cages. Really quirky stuff. Not as good as that, but this is a record that's worth checking out. Again, for the 4 or 5 standouts, sure. For the other songs, like I said, this is a song. This album it combines alt country, grunge, and noisecore. If that sounds like an unusual mix, it is. But the songs that veer more towards noisecore, no. The stuff that doesn't, awesome. So that's what I have to say about Rat Saw God by Wednesday. Art.
Yeah, rat shit, god awful. I'll keep this short. This album sucks. I'll give them credit for having a cool sound. I'm admittedly a sucker for anything that aspires to 1990s style alternative rock. The problem is, where are the songs? There are no songs.
Tracks 4 through 8. That's where the songs
Those
are.
aren't songs, dude. There isn't a single memorable or engaging melody, hook, chorus, or riff on the whole album. Your favorite song on the album, there's a pretty good riff in the chorus there. I'll give you that. But nothing else. I mean, it's exacerbated, and this whole and that nothingness, the no songwriting, it's exacerbated by the fact that the lead singer absolutely sucks with her.
But it's purposefully bad singing.
Yeah, but it's purposefully bad singing. You can pull it off if there's character in the voice. She doesn't have that character. There's not an ounce of character or anything that's compelling about her weak voice.
Oh, bullshit. I think it's really compelling. The only times it doesn't work is when they allow the guitar tapestry to overwhelm her vocals, which happens 2 or 3 times.
Yeah.
That's one complaint about the production. I wouldn't be surprised if Letterman had a hand in co-producing, because that was one of the things that killed his record from being the best album last year.
Yeah. Well, but this album just plods and plods and plods and plods into oblivion.
It certainly doesn't. It does in the first 11 minutes, and then it rocks out, and then it has kind of a tepid end. So that's what I would say.
Ass. This whole album is one gigantic tepid shit sandwich.
Chris here again. We usually end our episodes by inviting you to join our Curmudgeonly community page on Facebook. Well, we're picking up our efforts there. Know people just as passionate as us about rock and roll? Invite them to join in the fun. You don't actually need our permission to do so. Also, expect to see a lot more content up there moving forward. Our mission is to engage you, so darn it, we'll engage you like a fire hose, or maybe like a firehouse if we're going to give love to Gene Simmons. We may also be making a few offers. Want to wear a t-shirt featuring our logo? You may have that opportunity soon. So be a fellow curmudgeon, help us expand our little community, and share your own musings via your own posts. We're at facebook.com/groups/curmudgeonrock. Well, folks, this is exciting. We have renowned author Tony Fletcher as a guest with us today. Longtime music journalist and rock critic who these days lives in New York, originally from Britain. He has written, among others, biographies of the Smiths, Keith Moon, Eddie Floyd, which is an autobiography, and Wilson Pickett. He is the host of his own podcast, One Step Beyond, which is not a music podcast. If you want to learn about his adventures climbing Mount Kilimanjaro, that's your source. And of course, he is the author of a definitive volume on R.E.M. called Perfect Circle, last revised in 2013. Tony, welcome.
Thanks for the lovely intro. It's great to be here. Good to be on with you. Cheers.
Yeah,
absolutely. So this will be fun.
I'm a fan of your book, Tony, by the way, even though the book cover is not the one that you like.
Yeah. Well, it's been through some iterations, whichever the word is, but I do feel like it is the one book that, I was writing the first edition in '89 and the last edition in 2012 or something. So I do really feel that it's the full story, start to finish.
Sure, and it also helps that you, if I was counting from an article right, you were about 18 or 19 when both the Smiths and R.E.M. hit the street, and you moved to New York around the time that The One I Love was blowing up on MTV, and so it's kind of like this is the band. This is kind of the soundtrack of your life, literally. So that's great.
My love for R.E.M. is almost without reserve, and I'm happy to share that with people who may need any kind of convincing. Although in an ideal world, they wouldn't.
Yeah, but since it's not an ideal world, Artie, take us through 5 points why youngins should care and rediscover the joys of the wonderful R.E.M.
Yeah, before we get into what happened what made them decline in popularity, we got to talk about first what made them truly special and what made them great. Now, the first bullet point, we've set up 5 of these. And the first one is how unique and idiosyncratic their sound was, including their myriad of influences. Really, when they started out in the 1980s, no one sounded like them at all when they started. I remember there's been several, in allmusic.com, Stephen Thomas Erlewine said about R.E.M. that R.E.M. marked the moment when post-punk became alternative rock.
Yeah, and Tom Erlewine's one of my favorite critics, and so that's a great line.
Yeah, and he was right. Yeah. I mean, they started out as Birdsian mid-1960s jangle pop with a punky new wave beat. In later years, more politicized lyrics, meaning Stipe's vocals became more enunciated, meaning more power chords and heavier riffs from Buck's guitar, meaning more muscular drumming from Barry, all betraying garage rock and 1970s punk influences. Later on, more Beatles, Beach Boys, and even Richard Thompson influences shine through in their early 1990s output. And then later, grunge and glam rear their heads for their mid-90s output, grunge, a subgenre that they themselves helped influence, and then electronica in the immediate post-Bill Berry, the drummer, period. So, yeah, they had a unique sound that incorporated many other sounds. Some of them echoed from the past, but repackaged and reformulated and assimilated in ways that made it purely R.E.M. that no one else sounded like. Tony?
Yeah, I would agree. Nobody else sounds like R.E.M. A lot of that could be put down to Michael Stipe's very, very, very distinct voice, not one you confuse with too many other singers out there. But I give it to the band from start to finish. They found a unique sound with their first album, Murmur, which remains one of the great debut albums of all time.
Sure.
And they headed off in a multitude of different directions. As you say, their influence on the scene around them was profound. And, they also didn't mind admitting to and wearing their influences. But by the time they'd made that first album, they had developed their own sound, particularly in the studio, enough that they came out with some individuality. I got to say, by the way, while we're talking about sort of music critics and genres, it's an endless thing of mine, and I've written a book about a bunch of different scenes that came through New York City. And we never tend to call things by that name at the time. These names get applied afterwards. And as somebody who grew up in the post-punk era and was intrinsically involved in it, I don't recall anybody ever calling it post-punk until years down the line. I think alternative rock was more of a term, and college rock was more of a term. And to be fair, I think grunge was an expression that was hit on at the time. But you'd never have a band like a band that was an influence on other people going, oh, please call us a college rock band. Every band worth its salt is like, please don't label us, you know?
Yeah.
It's kind of amazing when you think about the maturity road that Michael Stipe went on. He goes from being a very shy, mumbly kid who's talking about a passion that's closer to Christ's passion in French to crafting a song suite. One of the best, most moving song suites about reaching your early 30s and finding your identity of anybody that's ever existed. And, to go from that sort of jangly lo-fi-ness to that lushness, bringing in JPJ. John Paul Jones to do the strings. It's a remarkably just rich journey for sure.
It really is. 15 albums, we should point out. And I was listening to your show on In Excess where you were talking about Mudhoney, and you're like, hey, they've just made their 12th studio album. Well, R.E.M. made 15 between 1983 and 2011.
Yeah.
And if you'd asked a couple of the band members, they would have wished it had been more.
Oh, yeah.
And so, this is a prolific output that's pretty much unrivaled by any band of quality beyond the 1960s. And in fact, the Beatles couldn't quite get to 15, I don't believe, at the time. It's a phenomenal output over essentially a 31-year career. And I think that's got to be taken into account, just the number of records and that it was 3 record contracts. There was something sort of quite tying it up in a bow at the end and saying, we've seen out a record deal. Nobody owes anybody anything for anything. And, job done.
Speaking of the Beatles, Tony, I'm glad you mentioned that. The second bullet point, and it's really related to the first one because it's in the same wheelhouse, is how much they changed and evolved over the years. And what I mean by that is that all great bands have multiple phases in their careers. R.E.M. have at least 5 that are very distinct and different from each other. Yet at the same time, those phases are all tied together in this gloriously progressive narrative arc. You can almost tell a story of their careers from one album to another. It's common critic speak to say, quote unquote, this band or this artist, they are the Beatles of such and such. But the striking manner in which R.E.M. changed and evolved over the years while maintaining such a high standard of output that arguably, or if not definitely, got better as they went on while amassing huge commercial hits. It really isn't out of bounds to call R.E.M. the Beatles of the American alternative rock movement.
Yeah, I was going to
Tony?
say,
No, not at all. I mean, to be honest, who else would you put that title on? They were like the first in many ways. They trailblazed the scene, and I've talked about the prolificity, which is I'm sure is a word, but not one you want to try and say too often after a couple of beers. And as we say, the progression and the variety, and that's a fascinating point about being able to sort of tell a band. I think the best groups you can indeed tell their biography, is chronological through the albums. You don't want to be able to interchange records, and you don't.
Yeah, and again, it's like Taste of the Month Club with them. Like like you said, I go back and forth too. Like Document's been my jam lately, and 2 points. One. They did kind of drop an Easter egg early because, Tack Piano appears in the middle of Reckoning, which is a cool touch. And they also have the best anti-neocolonialism song, Non-Clash Division. My personal favorite R.E.M. song is Welcome to the Occupation. 1 rocks, 2 just beautiful, and the lyric on it is incredible.
Anyway, the third point, and this is a point that needs a bullet point that needs to be hammered home as much as possible, is their impact on and their role in helping nurture the American indie underground scene. They weren't a relentless, uncompromising confrontational hardcore punk outfit like Black Flag. R.E.M. were much smarter and erudite and much more musically versatile. No offense to Henry Rollins and Greg Ginn. They weren't as idiosyncratic or as loopy as the Meat Puppets. R.E.M. were more focused and driven, and they weren't as abusive toward each other either. While they became intensely political later on, R.E.M. weren't as dogmatic in their politics as the Minutemen. Stipe's impressionistic lyrics gave the band's socio-political punch a deft touch, making it ambiguous and elusive enough for listeners who didn't care for or weren't listening for politics. They weren't as reckless or as self-destructive as the replacements. They were career-minded, but not in a blatantly commercial or shamelessly capitalist way. For as fun as the Red Hot Chili Peppers were during this time, and I love the Chili Peppers, but R.E.M. were never even remotely as dopey and as sophomoric as them. All of these aspects, in addition to the terrific songwriting and, as we said earlier, the startlingly unique sound that echoed the past without copying it, made them leaders of the American indie underground. And they became a band that every aspiring indie alternative band either wanted to be or wanted to open up for on tour. And they often did. Everybody opened for R.E.M. in the 80s. And as Kurt Cobain would continually allude to in interviews with discussing them, they were the guiding light in America in the 1980s in regard to making it, quote unquote, in rock and roll and making it in the right way. Right, Tony?
Yeah, correct on all fronts. You should probably put yourself out for hire writing introductions to books. I mean, that's a pretty good summary. That is a pretty good summary, especially if you want to make these sort of dreaded comparisons. When R.E.M. were on that initial scene, before it was really a college rock scene, they were just playing the clubs. They were the one band that didn't mind spending a Monday night, playing in some small town in South Carolina in a pizza bar, because there were 10 people would show up, and the next time they played there, there'd be 25, and they were having fun and doing that, and they really helped create a live music scene. Interestingly, Peter Buck said he never really realized just how big R.E.M. were. He just thought every town, every city had a band like an R.E.M. that was the big band in town, and we just happened to be the big one in Athens. It took them a while to realize they were actually creating a circuit that all these other bands then
it was like on. That the others were laggards. They were good bands, but they were laggards. One point to make about the social political thing, one of the joys of getting ready for this episode is I went back and the 1991 Video Music Awards. They won 5 awards that night, and he went out there and he had different T-shirts, and so he would rip one off. And so it was in order. It was Wear a Condom, Choice, Alternative Energy Now, The Right to Vote. That shirt was pink. The other ones were white, and Handgun Control. So
none of those stances have aged at all.
Well, that's actually, I'm thinking, is almost like a sad thing. I mean, the fact that we're still talking about handgun control. And,
no shit.
And too much of all of that. Maybe the one thing there that did shift was the AIDS epidemic, which would have explained probably more the wear a condom more than a contraceptive issue. But I mean, I think that their ability to be political without being overtly political. I think Michael was able to come up and take awards for just making really cool videos and get a message across, and they were able to do that frequently in their career. The politics is there if you want it, and if you don't agree with their politics, you don't really should not be listening to them, because they wore that on their sleeve as well. But they welcome to the occupation, which you just referenced. I mean, you can sing along to it. It's not. I could name some other groups where it's like, okay, guys, I'm having problems singing along here, but
it's not like listening to Phil Oakes.
No, that's a great example. Actually, that's a very good example.
Or I was going to say Ian MacKaye.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It wasn't an abrasive experience. So moving on. Hit us with more butter.
Political stances. In R.E.M.'s case, really, the next bullet point I really want to talk about, what made them special, is their socio-political activism and what it meant at the time, not just in the music industry, but to a whole generation of rock music fandom, especially Gen X people like ourselves. Remember, this was the 1980s. This was Reagan. This was oppressive social conservatism that culturally tried to bring America back to the first half of the 20th century. This was an era of ugly jingoism and obnoxious flag waving. This was an era of shameless, conspicuous consumption, greed, and proud ignorance. With the
Tell us how you really feel.
with the countercultural element in mainstream rock having long been snuffed out, the American indie alternative underground was the only place where dissent really existed. And I guess hip hop at the time as well. But in the hands of most of these bands, and for all their other splendid virtues, this dissent was presented in the most vague and general ways. Only REM and the Minutemen, and in this era, produced clear, straightforward political statements. And by the end of the 1980s, REM were the only ones putting their money where their mouths were in regard to overt activism in issues all across the socio-political spectrum.
Well, but they were the only ones that had the
true.
money.
But hey, but they
I
did
mean,
it. Others who had the
Yes.
money and more money didn't. And by the early 1990s, more than being just standard bearers of socially conscious rock in America, they were the socio-political conscience of American rock. Period. Really, you know.
Yeah, I want to actually jump on that and say, yeah, I appreciate you. You probably feel you're describing the USA in the 80s that way, but it was similar in the UK with Thatcherism, and it had a lot to do with why I left the UK. She got elected for a third time, and it was just too much.
Right.
And I had gotten involved. Basically, my path to move into New York was sort of set by then. I'd gotten involved with a band out of Boston. And they came over and lived in the UK for a while, and I had come to see them, and I fell in love with New York City, which fortunately was free of the worst elements of what you're talking about, despite the fact, of course, Wall Street is, right smack bang in the middle of Manhattan, but I didn't really have to interact with Wall Street. Anyway, the point being that this particular band were REM's generation. They were college kids that were a couple of years older than me and were actually pretty much REM's age and were massive fans, but equally were reaching different points of sort of potentially dropping off. But I think that their own politics was sort of infused by REM starting to have politics themselves. And it provoked with me, because I grew up in a much more left-wing environment, it provoked with me lots of interesting conversations about the US's involvement in Central America, and about we were having back and forths with about the Smiths and how Morrissey's lyrics could represent a culture that these Americans found hard to understand, but then they also were being exposed to Billy Bragg singing "Help Save the Youth of America," and we were having like lots of good conversations. And REM were very central. Now, I'm also going to throw it just quickly. This group of lovely people couldn't believe that I didn't know more about the Replacements. They were like, that's the real band. Like REM have been too big for too long. The Replacements are the real band, but the Replacements just could not address social political concerns. It wasn't in Paul Westerberg with his songwriting. So although I am forever grateful to my friends from Three Colours for turning me on to the Replacements to the point that the British hadn't really discovered them, REM had the message, they had the lyrics, and those were lyrics you could run with. And yet, as we found later on, they could still do love songs and personal songs and cover versions and all of it.
They did great covers too.
Yeah, great covers. And it's funny you mentioned the Replacements. Hey, Art, maybe we can get Bob Muir on here.
I read his book. It's a great book.
On that note, you have a fifth point there, don't you?
This is the big picture, where they are in the context of American rock music history. Okay, here's a list of bands / artists whose music was or has been directly influenced by REM in obvious ways, or have explicitly name check them as an inspiration or influence. Okay, let's first start with the minor scale, the second level bands. Toad the Wet Sprocket, the Gin Blossoms, Hootie and the Blowfish, Collective Soul, Local H, who, according to their Twitter account, named their band by combining the names of two R.E.M. songs, Oddfellows Local 151 and Swan Swan H. Next, the Cranberries, Live, Counting Crows, Built to Spill, Mercury Rev, and the Decemberists. Now, on a major scale, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Alice in Chains. Don't believe me? Check out those slightly off Lane Staley, Jerry Cantrell vocal harmonies and tell me they weren't influenced by those of Michael Stipe and Mike Mills. Radiohead.
Yeah,
Radiohead, the Pixies, Black Francis once mentioned how Murmur was a direct influence on his songwriting style. Pavement, Liz Phair, Stone Temple Pilots, particularly their expansive post-grunge period, the Flaming Lips, early Flaming Lips, Oasis, Coldplay. It's just really mind-boggling how many bands and artists, big names, have all either copied R.E.M., or were directly influenced by them, or just like explicitly acknowledged them.
Yeah, and there's probably some young bands now that are influenced by R.E.M. but have no friggin' idea.
Yeah,
I mean, that's how part of the DNA they are.
But I actually love that part of influences that you often don't know that you're like, you're listening to one band that's influenced by another. So you might be a fan of, Joe Strummer, not realizing that Joe's got it from Woody, or indeed you might be a fan of Bob Dylan, not knowing that Bob Dylan got it from Woody.
And it's one of my favorite lines on this podcast. If you haven't heard it, yes, you have.
Right. I mean, a cynic, Arturo might say, it would have been better if R.E.M. hadn't influenced half of those bands, because it was an interesting list. You managed to run off a bunch of groups,
especially the minor scale ones. Yeah, a lot of those bands aren't very good. I know.
Right, but right at the end, you hit on it, and I mean, funny enough, you put them into two different categories. But Mercury Rev, they live in my town in Kingston, New York,
really?
And Grasshopper.
Nice.
Grasshopper did a lovely event that I did at about 10 years back, where I did a talk about R.E.M. and the Smiths and what they had in common, and he got together with another friend of mine, and they played some R.E.M. and Smith songs together. And I know how much Grasshopper is influenced, because he desperately wanted to do the event. I just did this 40th anniversary event for Murmur, and he had a conflict, and he was really upset about it. So a lot of grunge is not my favorite music, but you named a lot of great acts there. And I also think you could go, once you start talking about R.E.M. with a certain generation, you would find maybe a lot of female singer-songwriters who you might not assume it because they're playing more delicate music, but you probably start hearing it in the chord structures, and you just talk to them and they're like, oh my God, I was the biggest R.E.M. fan at college.
Yeah. Perfect modern examples would be like Brandy Carlisle and Angel Olsen.
Sure.
I think that you can definitely check those two. By the way, Kingston represent. I was a Westchester guy for 7 years.
Right.
So
okay, good.
Yeah, love your area.
On this episode, we made the case as to why R.E.M. is one of the greatest American bands of all time and should be remembered in higher esteem by younger generation fans and critics. For the next episode, we're going from one Georgia musical great to another. And boy, is this one a doozy. Mr. Dynamite, Mr. Superbad himself, the hardest working man in show business, the godfather of soul, the architect of funk, James Brown. The man's influence and impact on both music and pop culture as a whole are incalculable. In fact, music as we know it today would not sound the same if Mr. Brown had never been born. And no, we will not shy away from the more negative and troublesome aspects of the man's personality. In fact, we welcome them because they will help us create a more well-rounded portrait of the man. Join us for the first of a 3-part series next time as the Curmudgeon Rock Report brings you James Brown, the super bad Mr. Dynamite of all legacies.
So, Tony, tell us a little bit about. I mean, you're obviously a very busy guy. You've talked about your REM circuit schedule. What do you have going on now, and what can we expect out of your mind and pen here soon?
Thanks for the opportunity to talk about it. I recently completed a second memoir that is actually a really it's a bird's eye view of the not a bird's eye. Sorry, it's a fly on the wall involved. I was there. Account of the early '80s scene, and actually R.E.M. make a very prominent appearance very late in the book, based on when I first saw
Nice.
them in the UK. I had a memoir out. It's actually a decade ago now. It's hard to believe. Called Boy About Town, that did really well and was greatly loved. And but being how I like to write, it only took me to the age of 16, hence the title. And this one
Yeah.
is called Teenage Blue, and essentially only takes me up to about 20. But the idea is, as well as a personal story of sort of success and failure in the music business as this sort of boy about town who was doing all kinds of stuff. It's also very much about the way that music scene changed in the UK from what we now call post punk to
Gotcha.
to a very commercial synth pop scene where it became
Awesome.
very me, and let's all be pop stars and drink cocktails and wear fancy suits.
Yeah.
Separately from that,
Hey, stop picking on Jarvis Cocker.
I think
Well,
he's talking about
I was
Spandau Ballet and Duran Duran, maybe.
I kind of am, but there were plenty of people that Phil Oakey would be a great example of somebody I once saw, at the Marquee with his lopsided haircut with an experimental synth band who only like 2 years later, the trio looked very, very different with the two girls alongside him, and yet Don't You Want Me is one of the great pop records of all time. But I digress.
Yeah, seriously.
I do have actually another podcast called the Jamming Fanzine Podcast, which that was the title of my old fanzine, but it's really more now a podcast about fanzines, and so I'm interviewing editors of fanzines.
Oh, that's cool.
So I'm happy to tip that off. And separately from that, there may be a pause for another book, because I actually, at the age of I'm up there with almost with the REM guys. I decided to finally go and get a degree, because I just jumped out of school at age 16. So I just came off this mad first semester where I took on way too much, but I had a fascinating time. And one of the courses I took was world music across cultures. And having traveled, I've got to tell you, it was so lovely to be writing about literally the music of the Pygmies, or Tibetan ritual music, but also about the influence, the impact. What was it? I called it the impact and influence of the Hawaiian steel guitar, which is essentially, the blues guitar.
Yeah.
And there's a fascinating story there.
Yeah, you win the cool competition for this
Yeah,
week.
so I've been having a lot of fun with that, and it actually has rekindled what's never really disappeared. But from a book perspective, it's a little hard to come up with the perfect, biography when they've all been written. And to find myself like digging deep and employing what I think are natural research tendencies, skills, whatever you want to, attributes that I have, and applying that to areas that I knew very little about, has been really rewarding, and has kind of like energized me in many, many ways. And so although I'm juggling a lot right now, I think that's a really good thing for me.
Awesome.
That sounds like a full thing. Somewhere in there you mentioned the pings and the pangs between successes and failures. Arturo, we have some pings and pangs of success and failure to get into here now. REM had an awesome streak. They were one of the house bands of MTV for about 5 years. RIP MTV News, by the way. So what the hell happened?
I mean, I came up with a couple of theories, 5 theories. I don't know if they're correct or not, but I think they may be close to it. The first one is the changing mainstream rock tastes from the mid-1990s onward, at least in America. It got heavier, gnarlier, more shouty. You had the emergence of rap metal / new metal. Then you had emo punk. Then you had in the early noughties, you had the garage rock revival, heavier stomping rock. So REM's kind of like smart, intelligent, reflective, expansive rock really kind of like became out of fashion, it seemed like. At least on
Yeah, and
on
and maybe the
American rock
record.
radio, everything got heavier, 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 heavier. I mean, I guess.
Personally, I blame Hootie and the Blowfish.
Yeah.
Yeah. They took REM's spot. There was only one spot left, and Hootie took it there for a couple of
Yeah.
years. So there you
What
go.
do you think, Tony?
What do you say, Tony?
Well, yeah, that's a very good point to hit on. And you also, a lot of people sort of jumped over and embraced the electronic music scene in the mid 90s as
Right.
well. And actually, I recently sat through the 3-part Woodstock 99 documentary.
Oh yeah, I lived it. That's a story for another day. But I lived Woodstock '99, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, I think but it highlights your point that by the end of the 90s, the big bands were bands I've never had any truck for, and would like to believe if I was 19 at the time, I still wouldn't have liked, Incubus and Linkin Park. And I want to distinguish maybe a Rage Against the Machine because we get back to the political
Limp
content.
Bizkit, Korn, Kid Rock.
Limbus, yeah. Korn. That's the group I was thinking of. It was Korn who were at Woodstock '99, right?
They all were.
Both there. Yeah.
They pretty much all were. Although Kid Rock's set was pretty good, but the rest of it.
Yeah, I think the scene. You're right. The scene changed. I'd had a lot of problems in the early '90s, right when R.E.M. were at their biggest, with grunge hitting and influencing and changing what people wanted to listen to on alternative music nights. At nightclubs.
But at least with the grunge, you can draw a line from REM to grunge.
Yeah,
you could do that.
The shouty stuff didn't help them. Tastes do change, and I think it's fair to say there's no expectation anybody should ever have to be in fashion all the time. The fact that there may be one superstar who never went out of fashion, one film star, one, that 100%. Those are the exceptions that prove the rule.
Right.
You're going to have a period of just not being in fashion. It's like expecting every sports star to be on their game every game.
Sure.
It doesn't work that way. They have their fallow periods and they have their injuries. And R.E.M. had a bit of both. Yeah. I mean, I've got some other theories, but it sounds like you've got more than one.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, maybe yours and mine will dovetail. The second one is, I guess, the sharp decline in quality of their latter period albums, meaning, i.e., they never had a quote-unquote comeback record, a la U2 in 2000 with All That You Can't Leave Behind, or Green Day in 2004 with American Idiot. They never had that kind of or even, I guess maybe even the Chili Peppers with Californication.
Well, I mean, to be fair, they did, but nobody cared. That was the difference. Like 2008 or 09, whatever that record was. Yeah, that was a fantastic record. But by then it was like,
it is a fantastic record, and I think you are right with what you're getting at there. Maybe it comes back to them being prolific. They didn't take necessarily the time off, and. I mean, it's an interesting point not having the comeback record. I don't think they ever felt the need to reinvent themselves to such an extent that they did a U2 with Achtung Baby, which I would say is singularly the greatest reinvention of any band ever, to go from being admittedly globally successful, but a joke, and recognizing that you're a joke and reinventing yourself and actually coming out cool. I mean, that's hard to do, and they you two get full credit for pulling that one off. Yeah, I think U2's. Sorry, let's get the right band's name. R.E.M's audience aged with them, and the band mellowed. And one point I have to make right now. I don't know where your listening figures are spread out, and I know Arturo, you're in South Korea, but towards the end of the band's R.E.M's career, as their sales literally fell off a cliff in America. I mean, I have printed them out somewhere. It was just crazy how they fell off a cliff, and yet around the rest of the world they were still growing in popularity. So they were still chalking up with something like Reveal several million album sales, many millions of album sales. They just weren't in America. So it's an interesting point that I think has to be factored in. Their American audience eventually gave up on them with new albums, still went to see them. The rest of the world was still kind of playing catch up.
Yeah. You want to hear a crazy stat, Tony? from Spotify. What's it called? An imitation of
Yeah,
life.
that's
Is
a
that?
song.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's from Reveal. 52 million plays on Spotify.
Wow.
Orange Crush, 47 million. That's crazy to me.
It is. It is. And by the way, just 2-3 weeks ago, or maybe a month ago now, Losing My Religion hit 1 billion. It got to that, and
Yes.
that's clearly the one that people play. I try not to put too much truck in the Spotify
Yeah.
stats, because who's listening, what are the algorithms doing, blah blah blah. But I think that's it's a point that those later songs, they were big on. There's, as Coldplay have proved, the audience for that kind of mid-tempo ballady rock is unlimited, at least among white people.
Right.
Yeah, the
It don't
question is,
die.
why
Yeah, among
weren't
whites. Yes.
R.E.M. forgiven for not having that quote unquote comeback record? Countless artists have never had a comeback record, and they're still like remembered more fondly than R.E.M. That I don't understand.
Well, all right, it's not something I've lost sleep over in the past, but what I would say to that is, by the time they made Accelerate, they already knew they were making 2 more albums and calling it a day. So
Oh,
so
okay.
they made Accelerate as a mea culpa, I mean, literally in my book, I sat with Peter Buck after the breakup,
Yeah.
and he said, we were so disappointed with Around the Sun that we did sit there and say, is this it? We've got to call it a day. I mean, we don't have it anymore. They placed a lot of blame on the production, and I think that's correct. But they said, no, we're not going to do that. There's no way we're going out on a low. We're going to go out on a high. And they made a decision
Yep.
then, an internal decision. We're going to do 2 more albums. We're going to see out our contract, and we're going to call it a day. And they didn't tell anyone, and they pulled that off as a secret. But I think that might explain why their comeback was not Achtung Baby, which is like, a massive statement.
Yeah.
It was garage rock. This is our reckoning all over
Yes.
again. And then their final album was almost like a pastiche or a greatest hits
Yeah.
covered tribute band of R.E.M.
Yeah.
And then it was Sia. So there was only one tour for them to do that comeback and be that kind of band.
Yeah, that's very good color, Tony. Thank you for thank you for providing that. So,
Yeah.
Art,
Very,
you got
very
any other
quickly.
crazy theories here?
Overexposure. Were they just overexposed too much in the early to mid 90s? I mean,
Well, so was U2.
Yeah.
So was Metallica. So was
Yeah.
so was Oasis. Although Oasis
Yeah,
they fell
of
off a cliff
course.
too.
Right.
Well,
Well,
I'm
go ahead.
wondering if you're getting at the point I would want to make, and I'm just going to jump in
Go
with it
for
here
it.
because I think it's the right
ahead.
point, the right time to make it. R.E.M., as we've already cited several times over, were leaders. They were influences on other people. They didn't mind admitting and loved talking about their own influences, but they were leaders. They were unique, and they sort of set the path, both like in terms of a music business and an alternative
Yeah.
scene, and creatively. And because they'd had so much success with Out of Time, not touring that album, they stayed home and made Automatic for the People and got even bigger. And so they didn't tour that one. And then for whatever reasons, and I understand it, those are very laid back records, basically almost Automatic for the People is almost acoustic. And they said, time to make a rock record again. But you know what? Now that we're superstars, let's make a big rock record. So they made Monster. Cue the ironic album title. And although Monster is actually way more left field than it might seem with that title and the period, it is still their attempt at the big rock statement. And having taken 3, 4, maybe even best part of 5 years off the road, they were like, "Hey, we can do stadiums as well. We are a big rock band. Let's go out and do this. Let's have our fun." And I felt that all of a sudden, this band was now behind the curve. They were calculating something. with
Yeah, they
Monster.
were kind of facsimiles of themselves.
Yeah, and they set off on this like, right, okay, we're going to do the big tour with all the all the big things you will need on a stage to make this tour work. And Michael, in particular, Michael Stipe, was very comfortable by that point with his role as a sort of a
Rock star.
rock leader. So yeah, statesman, not an elder statesman, but a rock star. However, I felt that was the first time I felt I was losing my band, and with it came just their good luck ran out, and they had a lot of illnesses and a lot of problems on that tour,
Sure.
and it resulted in the tour being postponed a couple of times, and of course Bill Berry's aneurysm on stage in Switzerland, and his very near survival. And not surprisingly, after seeing through the tour and finishing making the next album, part of which had been sort of woodshedded on tour, Bill left. And so your argument there is, they rode it for 9 albums, and then their sort of luck ran out. What could have befallen and has befallen other bands earlier, they all got to live, but there were some serious problems. The tour was obviously seen as a bit of a disaster, and particularly with Bill leaving, they were never able to get their mojo back.
Yeah, you want to hear the punchline on this, Tony?
Go.
So about a month ago, some guy on YouTube had Mike Mills and Michael Stipe on as guests, and I guess the question came up, what's your favorite R.E.M. album? What was Stipe's answer? New Adventures in Hi-Fi. Close second, Reveal.
Fascinating.
So, yeah, which is just interesting. Just sort of, I guess it was just sort of living through the experience.
Favorite
and
R.E.M.
maybe
album?
the sort of the...
no one cares.
Mills, they didn't get him, but Mills was talking up New Adventures in Hi-Fi. Well, he talked about how exciting the process was of just sort of in and out of studios or sound checks, or just kind of like the band on the run, literally, recording as
I think bands have a right to say, hey, you may not have loved it to the same extent we did, but we are proud of this. One day you'll know we were right. I think it's fine for bands to do that, but there may be a little bit of the disconnect by then between what they were getting a kick out of doing and what people wanted to hear in big numbers. In big numbers.
Right.
And I also think the diaspora too mattered too. That was around the time that Stipe settled in L.A. and Buck moved up to the Pacific Northwest as well, and so they weren't like 4 guys in a van anymore.
Right.
All right. So the fourth point, and this is kind of the elephant in the room, and I'm not saying this is definitely the case, but I kind of smell it a little bit, and it's Michael Stipe's sexuality in a time of macho, aggressive mook rock. By the mid-90s, Stipe never came out in a big way, but he didn't really hide it anymore that he was gay. And mid-90s to late 90s, like I mentioned earlier, is when the really hyper, uber aggressive nu metal / rap metal started hitting the American rock mainstream. And all of a sudden it seemed like there was no room for that kind of sensitive guy frontman, unless he was big and burly with tattoos, and I think it kind of stained them for a little in the subconscious, not internationally, but of the American music fans. Americans are pretty backwards about this,
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, at the beginning,
precedent for this. The precedent is Queen. Look at Queen. In 1980. They were huge in America, all over the world, but they hit their apex popularity in America after the Game album, with another one, Bites the Dust, and Crazy Little Thing Called Love. All of a sudden, Freddie Mercury started dressing more obviously gay, hanging out in gay nightclubs. The next Queen album was basically an electro pop gay dance club record, Hot Space. And immediately after, by 82, 83, Queen's popularity, nosedived in America. And that really did coincide with Freddie Mercury being more open, maybe not verbally, but just in showing his sexuality more. And it turned off a lot of American hard rock music. And Queen appealed to hard rock fans at the time. Hard rock.
You sure it wasn't the Flash Gordon thing?
Yeah, maybe. And hard rock metal fans. Yeah. And it really took until Freddie Mercury's death for Americans to re-embrace Queen. you know. So I really do think, even though now we live in a time where homosexuality is more accepted and easier to live with for some music fans out there, I think Stipe's more overt sexuality, it may have had the Queen effect on REM. I could be wrong. I hope I'm wrong, but
Well, I find you articulated that very well. It's really interesting. You've obviously been thinking about this. I don't know that alone would have done it. I mean, I think we've talked about the the creativity went a bit. They had they had some bad luck. A key band member left. There's a lot of factors, and I think that they all come together. But I mean, it is really, really interesting. God, there's a lot that could be said here, but I would want to say it very, very carefully because back when I wrote my first edition of the biography in '89, which does seem like it is years ago. There were people that wanted me to out Michael Stipe because I knew at that point. Right. And I'd grown up in my own little DIY post punk as it's now known culture, where I understood that it was rock and roll was where the freaks and the losers and the gay people and the everybody who didn't fit into society was you gravitate to some form of the arts. It's just what you do. Unless you become a hermit. So, I'd always been around people that I never even questioned. And I knew it was not my role to put somebody in the spotlight like that. It fell to the British music press that really reached a bit of a nadir around Automatic for the People when they sort of decided en masse that Michael Stipe was singing about the fact he had AIDS, which is just so much BS. I mean, it's just pathetic.
But that's like the beginning of the internet too, like the is he or isn't he?
Yeah, it was really pathetic. I mean, all right, so Michael had to come out, had to come out and say, I'm more or less coming out. You would like to feel it certainly didn't harm the group with Automatic for the People, and it didn't with Monster. But I take your point. The music world changed by the late 90s. And when, again, going back to look at some of the horrendously, well, for me, horrendous, but horrendously popular performances at Woodstock 99. Sure, R.E.M. couldn't have fitted in on that stage. But it's not just down... It's not just down to Michael. You also would have to allow. I've old enough and I've been around enough people. By the point that all that's going on, R.E.M. have made like this just a band that formed for fun, for a party. Yeah. I mean, they literally got together to play they were playing, but it wasn't to their roommate put together a party that they were like, all right, well, we'll do a gig. So you've exceeded beyond your wildest dreams. You become superstars. You're very, very rich and that has some kind of an influence. Like you're like, what do I still need to prove? So even with the best of artists, there can be a different kind of hunger. The hunger can be more creative and like, hey, if I don't sell, well, it's not like I haven't made my money. It's not like I haven't made my mark. I just, I think some of that comes into play as well, so that we shouldn't feel like Michael would be sitting there licking his wounds and being like, oh, where, how did I lose people? I think the Michael would be
he goes off and he produces Being John Malkovich.
Yeah, I think Michael would say I was having the time of my life. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And then Peter Buck got to the point where he did Arthur Buck.
There you go.
Which is actually a pretty fantastic record. Folk disco. You should check that out, Arturo, if you haven't heard it. But it's pretty good.
And my last little bit about what happened, just the overall musical tastes of millennials and Gen Zers. Like really?
The social media gatekeepers
R.E.M. influenced a lot of the bands and artists that the younger generation rock fans like. Why can't they make that trip back to R.E.M.? I don't get it.
Yeah, there's a disconnect. And I do think there's that social media thing of like taste making officially stopped in 2005, like centralized taste making. And so once YouTube and Facebook and user generated content take over, now it's like the hot take of the month. And so I made this point last episode, but I'll make it again, like Along December by Counting Crows, great song. It's been deified. Okay, well, why hasn't a few of like and like Shiny Happy People, for whatever reason, has become like a go-to mock. Yeah, you still get like memes and like nasty stuff posted on them. Mike Mills's Twitter feed, by the way, is wonderful. He's just a nasty son of a bitch these days. He doesn't care.
I got off Twitter because of Elon Musk, but
because of Musk.
But maybe I'd be happy to hear the highlights. But good for Mike. Good for Mike.
Yeah, basically he trolls conservatives all day long. It's really fun. Like he was picking on Charlie Kirk this morning.
Well, that's sort of what I mean. It's like they're like, hey, maybe I may be getting my kicks in a different way. I don't have to kind of go and like sleep in the van for the rest of my life to enjoy what I'm doing.
They leave the analysis of why things fell apart to us, because they're busy living.
Exactly.
So with that said, Arturo, I understand that you have put together a list. And I want to run through these real quick of what you think are the 10 greatest American bands of all time. Knowing our weird chemistry, I will probably disagree with like 6 of them, but I want to hear what Tony. This will be fun. So lightning round.
Well,
give us your top 10 American bands.
Let me qualify this, saying my parameters for this are not just commercial success, but overall importance, influence, and cultural impact. Okay, so that all factors in here. Not just like, they sold a lot of records.
Gotcha.
No, how influential they were, how important they were to rock music in general, and how not just in their country and within the U.S., but like how they inspired rock music bands and fans and throughout the world as well. And how influence is a big thing here. But anyway, my number 10 are the Byrds. Okay, because they pretty much kickstarted so many subgenres, folk rock, country rock. They were one of the first ones at the gate there with psychedelic rock, raga rock, space rock, whatever you want to call it. The Byrds were for 4 or 5 years, they were just like creating subgenres with every record. But anyway, them. Number 9, I have your favorite, Chris, Creedence Clearwater Revival. Because
that's my number 1, Tony. Just so you know, I
we're
think
talking top 10 American bands, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Notice no solo artists, no Dylan, Springsteen, Hendrix.
Right, sure, I get it.
Those are, the Jimi Hendrix Experience. I'm sorry, if you're putting your name in front of the band's name, it's not a band. It's a solo artist with a backing band.
Yeah. No offense to Noel Redding, but
anyway. So I have CCR 9 because even though they weren't from the South, they pretty much created the template for Southern rock. They really did. Number 8, Metallica. Now, it doesn't matter. Remember, I tried to be objective about this. I like Metallica. I'm not the world's biggest Metallica fan, but I do acknowledge that they were hugely important in the development of heavy metal. There's heavy metal before Metallica, and there's heavy metal after Metallica. And they influenced the world when it came to heavy metal. I think you got to put Metallica in there.
Yeah. Any thoughts on that one, Tony?
I am all for the rock and roll being a broad church. I did another podcast and we got talking about the Rock Hall of Fame because I get a vote on after the nominating committee. I get one of those votes that doesn't really mean much, and I put my personal tastes aside.
Yeah, you have to.
Yeah. I mean, I voted for Iron Maiden, who I never, because I just saw why aren't they in there already? Yeah. So I've got no problem with Metallica being on that list at all. It doesn't matter if I listen to them or not.
Yeah, and same thing with them. The fact that they did those first 5 records in 8 years is astonishing.
Anyway, number 7, Talking Heads. I put them here because they pretty much set up the template for what indie used to be. Indie rock, independent label rock music. Now indie is basically a subgenre. And Talking Heads set up the template for what we know now is that danceable, funky rock sound that is indie. That's Talking Heads. Talking Heads also,
the MGMT also thing,
bridging, creating a bridge between rock fans, punk fans, new wave fans, and going back and listening to Afro-Cuban music and going back to the sources in Africa. And I'm one of those people who got into Fela Kuti through Talking Heads. So Talking Heads were kind of like
Yep.
a gateway band for a lot of Latin music and for a
Yeah.
lot of rock
Oh,
music fans to appreciate Latin and African music. Plus, they set the template for indie and intelligent indie as
oh
well.
gosh darn Rhode Island. Gosh darn Rhode
Right.
Island School of Design.
Anyway, number
Gotta love it.
6,
Okay.
R.E.M., like we just spoke of. Number 5, I have Nirvana, because
Oh,
post Kurt
that's
Cobain's
interesting.
death, Nirvana's myth has taken a life of its own. Among
Oh yeah.
younger generation fans, like for us of our generation, our maybe I don't know about you, Tony, but like for me and Chris, the Beatles were our rock and roll gateway. Guess what? For kids now in their early 20s and teens, Nirvana is their rock and roll gateway.
Yeah.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
um,
Oh, absolutely. They, especially because Something in the Way was like a number
yeah,
one hit like last year. So kind of amazing. I'm amazed by the way that you have REM at 6. That
yeah.
I'm
Anyway,
really now intrigued. But
I'm
go
trying to
ahead.
be objective. Number 4, The Grateful Dead. You have to, no matter what you think of jam band music, the Grateful Dead created a culture. You can't say that about many bands.
Yeah.
They created a culture. When you think of hippies,
Yeah. Without the Dead, the Stones don't get Virgin to sponsor a
yeah.
tour
But
for
they
sure.
created a culture. I mean, I am a Dead fan. I admit I do like the Dead. I like punk. I like hippie. I don't care. The Dead. They beyond creating their culture, they had this musically. They actually surpassed the Byrds in terms of this beautiful tapestry of pure American music and getting every stream of every aspect of American music you can think of beyond the jamming on stage stuff. They did that as well, if not better than anyone else. And of course, I mean, like just they were an industry. I mean, you got to give them credit for that.
Yeah.
Number 3, The
Sure enough.
Stooges. I have them as number 3. Yeah,
Yeah.
the
Good
Stooges. I
call.
mean, they didn't invent punk rock, but they pretty much may as well have been the first American punk rock band.
Yeah, and they bashed the fuck out like, pardon the French, but they bashed
Yeah,
out like better than
yeah.
any band of its
Right.
type, pretty much ever.
Yeah, I mean, they inspired so many bands, including some of the bands on this list that I just mentioned. Number 2, the
Yeah.
Beach
Hmm.
Boys. I have them at number 2 because they're kind of the prototype for the American rock and roll band. They were the American answer to the Beatles.
Yeah,
Brian Wilson was a genius.
yeah,
Pet Sounds. I mean, any mind that,
yeah, and they also took the doo-wop harmony and basically
yeah,
mainstreamed it for white
totally.
America, and so Wilson doesn't
Yeah,
get enough
and
credit
number
for that.
1, and this is maybe one that may be a little controversial for some, the Velvet Underground. No,
Pavement.
I
Oh,
have
Velvet
them as the
Underground. Oh, I thought you
greatest,
were going to say
most
Pavement.
important, and influential American band of all time, because yeah, no, the
VU.
Velvets, absolutely,
Okay.
because um, without the Velvets, there is no punk, there's no goth, there's no alternative, there's no indie. All of that you can trace to the Velvet Underground. REM you can trace to the Velvet Underground. Nirvana you can trace to the
Yeah,
Velvet Underground. Talking Heads you
yeah,
can trace to the Velvet Underground. Like it's
yeah.
like everything
You,
starts with
you
them.
just
Like they really were.
Yeah, you just birthed a really good talking point, Arturo. Sorry to cut you up. You birthed a really good talking point. Tony, do you see a direct line between VU and the Smiths?
Between VU and the Smiths, yeah. I
I
mean,
do.
I do. I know. Uh, yeah, I know that was one of many influences on the Smiths, but I mean, it was a massive, massive, massive influence on REM because you only have to look at their early cover
Yep.
versions. Velvet
Hmm.
Underground was a way in for Michael Stipe and Peter Buck to befriend each other. That was
Yeah,
something that they had in common. They didn't have like a whole bunch of music in common, but they had the Velvet Underground. Lists are of course subjective.
Sure.
We're not talking
yes,
the 10 biggest selling records of all time, which even now is quite hard to
right.
do
Yeah,
with authority. So what I
streaming.
think you
Yeah,
can, I think if you take out the greatest and you sort of say the most influential and would you say impactful, I might not argue with your list, except I was wondering, like, as you went on, like, were you really going to put the Ramones at number 3, 2, or 1? So I think that the Ramones deserve a
yeah,
place on that list. The greatest thing is entirely subjective. I have often come into these kind of discussions by saying that REM are for me. Uh, in many, many, many ways, the greatest band, period. And there are many reasons that I say that, and we've touched on most of them, but not all of them on this show. And I still want to kind of maybe dive in a bit more to why they're not respected, to what extent they're respected right now, and whether it should be more. But the reason I say that is for a lot of reasons that we've touched on. The number of great albums,
Sure.
just the sheer breadth, the sheer number of great albums, the breadth of the great albums, the influence and impact that they had. And while we have certainly touched on the politics, I don't think we've touched on an aspect about how they ran their business.
Yeah.
And I have been around rock and roll since I was 13, all kinds of music, and I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. And R.E.M. all the way through managed to maintain a way of doing business that was honorable and decent. They were, as far as I could tell, in any interactions with them or management, they were friendly.
Mm-hmm.
You can call it just like good old Southern sort of, manners. They did not subscribe to the notion that you had to be nasty to get on in the music business. And they don't get enough credit for that. Now, there have been one or two battles they fought, and they will close ranks if somebody tries to wedge that, get in on them, or if somebody does piss them off. They have an ability to close ranks. They've also been run very well as a business, but there was a sort of positivity and a down-to-earth aspect about them. I mean, Michael Stipe, at some of the peak of his fame, you'd run into him in like the dive bars of New York City. The week that Automatic for the People came out, I needed to interview Peter for an update, and he chose the most obviously grungy Mexican restaurant on the Lower East Side, and they were very comfortable with that. They were very comfortable with how they were. They had a habit of always looking at the guest list, and like it literally got handed to them along with like a set list, so that they knew who was showing up that night. And so they could actually look for their friends. There aren't many bands who bother with that anymore. It's like, the manager might have put somebody on the guest list, but the band wanted to know who's coming tonight. We want to be able to say hello to them. They came out to their own meet and greets after shows, at the top of their fame. So there are many reasons that I call them the greatest. And I want to get back to the point that they split up after 15 albums, and we didn't make this final point. They did so as friends.
Yeah. You don't get that
there
often.
Was no. Well, you need to name me another group that went 15 albums, 3 record contracts deep, saw out their record contracts, made, let's allow like 10 to a dozen superb albums along that run.
Not Jefferson Airplane?
Right. There's no, and still had 3/4 of the band members intact. And let's allow 10 years, 12 years down the line from breaking up, when there was a 40th anniversary tribute concert for Chronic Town last fall, all 4 members showed up and were photographed hanging together watching the show. Nice. So again, you're not going to get that from anybody else. So for me, I may have a different favorite band on a different day of the week, but they are my ideal of what a band could and should be.
Sure. And to borrow a word that you used on another podcast recently, impeccable.
And you're not the only one, Tony. There's a guy out there called Peter Tabakis, who's also a music writer, and he wrote for several years ago for a website called Spectrum Culture, and he basically, the title of his article, "The Best Band Ever, R.E.M." So you're not alone,
right? And he didn't put a question mark.
No question mark.
Good.
No, he did not. He was very commanding in making that assertion. And there are those people.
They
out
are
there.
my ideal.
We all have our favorites.
Yeah, they are my.
I'll go balls to the wall for CCR.
Right.
But I also have R.E.M. at number 2, by the way. Would probably be my second.
I wanted to just throw out. I know we're almost done, but I'd sort of seen that the premise of what we were going to talk about. And I'm kind of glad we haven't given over the whole episode to this. Is why they're not respected so much by Gen Z and millennials, and like what's wrong, either what's wrong with the kids, or why do R.E.M. not get their chops where maybe Nirvana and Pixies still do? And without literally asking that question, you've hit on a lot of very, very good points. But I actually decided in preparation for this to pose that kind of question online. And I got, it's interesting. I'm actually going to quote, maybe it was you, Arturo, maybe you, Chris, but you literally had on your show notes, most younger generation rock music fans, particularly millennials and Gen Z people, have either completely forgotten R.E.M. or just outright dislike them. Now, admittedly, the people that I'm around on Facebook are more like my age, but then again, many of us have kids, and there was a real breadth and variety of replies. I want you to know that some people. I mean, I literally had a couple of people came out and said when they got into them, it was. So let me just read you this one. I think this is helpful. Now, admittedly, this person's on a music site, but he says, I'm an early millennial who's loved them a long time with mates who are the same. Part of the way in was via Pavement, who, were influenced by R.E.M. But the statement is pretty true. Peers who are casual listeners probably think of them as remember the 90s video special material, while plenty of keen music types rubbish them in the same way as Pixies and Nick Cave, like too obvious, soft, shallow. And he does put it, what a way to live. I didn't think Pixies and Nick Cave were considered, unhip like that.
I thought Pixies were considered super hip by the kids. I guess I'm out of touch.
Yeah. Well, but by the kids, Nick Cave, no, but I wouldn't have thought.
I got somebody else. I was born in 1980 and caught the tail end of their commercial peak. At the time, I guess I thought of them as slightly bloated Q magazine middle-aged man fodder, which I think, by the way, is fair of him to say that. One stupid stage prop and a meeting with the Pope away from becoming U2. Although they were friends with and were admired by Kurt Cobain, I never really detected their influence on Nirvana, who were more indebted to Pixies and Mudhoney. I later discovered the IRS albums, Murmur through to Document, and think they're largely great. Given that they were nearly everywhere for much of the 90s, no bands really cite them as a key influence now, nor do you ever hear a song and think, oh, they've been listening to a lot of R.E.M. And he ends up by saying, for all their ubiquity, they've left comparatively little trace. I think we have in this show sort of demonstrated that they've left an enormous trace, even if it's not overt.
Yeah.
But I had people saying, hey, my kids love them. And I had people saying, I work with millennials and they've got no idea who R.E.M. are. And if it helps, and it may not help, but I work with and direct shows with the Rock Academy here, where I have enormous fun. And
nice.
Really interestingly, we do a lot of different music, and I was meant to be doing the Doors this summer, and it got pulled because kids weren't signing up. And I would have said 10 years ago, they would have signed up for the Doors. I mean, the Doors were one of these groups that you go through your Jimi Hendrix period, your Nirvana period, your Doors period. So
no more Doors.
So apparently, no more Doors period. And this is maybe not. It was not a representative sample, but I was in there with the boss, and I said, R.E.M. I keep pitching you R.E.M. because we needed to do something. This particular show that wasn't too complicated musically. And he's like, like, okay, let's think about it. And he came back later and said, we sort of did a pop poll of the kids who are taking lessons here now, and people are in the room, and none of them have heard of R.E.M. So it's not going to be R.E.M.
It's not like they don't like R.E.M. They don't even know them.
I think that is. Yeah. I think that's partly it. You actually, it surprises me, sometimes to know what the kids are into. You put up a show and they all sign up for it. Yeah. They all signed up for Fleetwood Mac. What are you going to do?
Well,
TikTok. But hey, I mean, there's worse fates.
Has a lot to do with the Fleetwood Mac resurgence.
Yeah, with the whole dreams thing. Hey, social media, it's a strange place, but it does wonderful things like giving Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham their
I also want to say there's a very final point I want to say. So I haven't written a book on R.E.M. and on other acts. I that final update I did was it was too soon after. I should have just told my editor, you know what, the band broke up for a reason. Let's wait 2 years and do an update. So we did the update, and that one with the three of them on the cover sort of, slipped out. But fortunately, a few years later, I got to say, I think they were running out of copies finally. I said, can we please change the cover? And then I just want to go to bed happy. It was never a hardback, but this book's been a great success. People have loved it. The band were impressed by it.
Absolutely.
And we've done that. And then I will say to you, in the last 3 to 4, maybe as much as 5 years, the book has started selling again in quite considerable numbers. Of late, outselling the Keith Moon book. And I mean, I could get on my high horse and say, that's maybe because there's nobody left to buy the Keith Moon book because it's sold a lot. But I've been really quite impressed. And similarly, when I did this 40th anniversary event for Murmur here in a town called Saugerties, a lot of people showed up. And that was partly because radio wanted to interview me about it. The NPR station did. So my sense is that R.E.M's influence is still noted. The older generation are aware of it, and people are discovering the band. I mean, somebody's got to be buying these books. And interestingly, a number of the sales are in America.
So there you go, folks. Maybe R.E.M. isn't as dead in the water as we thought, and there is very much hope for the world. Thank you so much, Tony Fletcher, for bringing that little slice of dialectic into our episode and our revisitation of R.E.M. And thank you, Tony, so much for joining us for this episode. We really, really appreciate your interest and your passion, and we're very much excited about bringing your perspective onto this episode of the Curmudgeon Rock Report. As we always end these episodes with, folks, check us out and join the Curmudgeonly community on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/curmudgeonrock. If you have anything to say about this episode or have your own view on R.E.M., catch us at curmudgeonrock@gmail.com. And for now, we're still on Twitter, although our presence is dwindling as it becomes a blue check dystopia. We're there at Curmudgeon Pod. We mentioned Mike Mills's feed. We love it. You should check that out as well. Take care, folks, and we'll see you next time when we'll start talking about Mr. Dynamite himself, James Brown.